Hi, this is Richard Grieco for RunItOnce.com. This is going to be part 4 of my review of a deep run I made in the Scoop 2019 10K PLO event. We're getting towards the end of the re-entry period, although probably still a way away from its conclusion. That typically occurs when the starting stack is roughly sort of 16-20 big blinds, so a few levels out. Tables got switched up at the end of part 3, so a quick rundown of the people we're up against now, starting on my immediate left and going clockwise. Yubembas, you may recall from my previous Scoop hand history review, he's had some pretty decent results in these fields, so I'd assume he's maybe doing some things well. If I had to guess, I'd say he's good at kind of the street poker element of tournaments, but from my perspective, he's displayed some pretty erratic tendencies in decision-making, both pre- and post-flop. The next guy, I'm pretty sure his name is Espen, so I'm just going to call him that. Espen's a long-time PLO reg at mid to high stakes. Type of guy who's pretty aggressive, puts you in tough spots at a reasonably high frequency. He has my stars color code for just like what I would call a wild card reg, so a reg who's capable of a wider array of things than some people who are more in line. But very good player and tough opponent. Linus, my personal exposure to, is pretty limited, but he was pretty much universally considered the best no-limit player in the world a year ago, maybe still is. I don't think he played much PLO at this particular point in time, although he's played a lot more now. He's been getting in quite a lot of volume at heads-up PLO at high stakes against tough opposition. But yeah, I think maybe at this point in time when the tournament was played, he was a little bit inexperienced, although that's kind of a tentative assumption and not one that I start letting carry any weight in my decision-making if I end up in a pot against him. Cleaner and Ravenswood are kind of similar. To start with, I'm pretty sure they're both Dutch. They're also very good long-time regs who've kind of disappeared a little bit over the last couple of years. Still pop up, obviously, during the big coups and such. I'm not sure if they've moved on to other things, or if they're focusing on live, or whatever. Obviously, life has a way of getting in the way of people's careers and interrupting the volume they get in from time to time. In any event, both are very good, tough players who you'll rarely see a mistake of any significance from. Plan for this video is to continue our mix of hand history review and solver analysis. And we're going to get started with this hand, which is hand number 43. Pretty easy one to start with. We make a standard open and win blinds. Repeat the process this time, but one interesting difference is that we've started to size down. We went 3.5x the hand before, and the next time we VPIP, the level's gone up, and we're now making it kind of what looks like my 2.37x sizing. So this would be an indication, since nothing meaningful has changed in terms of stack distribution, although it looks like Espen busted, that I've started, at some point I just reach a stage in the tournament and I decide, okay, well now it's a reasonable point to start playing a strategy with more of an eye towards kind of reducing variance, or kind of an unsatisfactory way of explaining that. But you kind of get to a certain point and start implementing that strategy rather than kind of still just bombs away 10 hours into the tournament or whatever. And that kind of inflection point seems to have been reached for me now. Cleaner limps cutoff. He's the second reg to do that in a relatively short space of game time. We saw Scareboy do it in the middle of the last installment. Again, not something that I have much time for personally, but I'm not going to evaluate it as an error exactly. It's just something that I choose not to have part of my strategy, and kind of went over that and the reasons why in part 3. In any event, we have a super clear ISO with reasonable kings. Check to us on a board where we do pretty well in terms of equity and polarity, range versus range. Typically, you're pretty aggressive here with a nut flush draw, but even more aggressive with the nut flush draw blocker. The reason being that the nut flush draw blocker has some amount of removal, immediate removal, and future barrel EV, but doesn't have the actual equity that the nut flush draw has. So Pretty much always betting this combination, I think, especially with kind of lowish EV check and some turns we can barrel and so on and so forth. No pair, like a pair block, like King 9-7 would be nice, but can't have everything. And I think I'm betting at a super high frequency on this board anyway, in position and still relatively high SPR. Go with limp. It's a little bit unusual for me to build in a limping range this early in a tournament. It was potentially a factor of it being a 10k, and although you obviously should play each hand on its merits, you know, you're just a little bit more naturally inclined to chill out with the variance when you're playing higher than when you're playing like a 200 or a 500 or whatever. So I'm not sure if I should have a limping range at this point in terms of chip EV. For dollar EV, it's probably reasonable, and this hand seems like a decent limping candidate in that it doesn't really block 3-bets. It performs pretty poorly against 3-bets because of the redundant 4. Does okay by playing a pot against wider ranges. It also has one of the higher flush draws, which both makes us more likely to VPip it, like we may just fold Queen 10-9 deuce, let's say, for example, and also like makes us a little bit less unhappy about playing multi-way because we dominate a few more flush draws than if we'd had, or a few more combinations of flush draws, only one specific rank, the jack-high flush draw, than if we had, let's say, the 10-9 of hearts. Flicking over to the solver, I've created kind of an approximation of a hand class here, so 3 pretty connected, but not zero-gapped high cards that are single-suited, and then have a low redundant wheel card. And they do seem to be preferring limp pretty heavily. Like, we have limp as a part of our strategy at 50 big blinds, so I mean, we're about 70 big blinds deep in the hand in question, so I guess having some limps isn't that bad. Although you wouldn't like lose a ton of EV by playing pure raise, I would think. The gain would be more in reducing your overall near-term volatility. In any event, we kind of heavily prefer to limp these hands when we do have them, and it seems to be relatively straightforward. Like, we fold a little bit more when we have the very lowest cards, even though there's practically speaking minimal difference between, King Queen 9-4 and King Queen 9 deuce. And we also fold a little bit more when we have some of the lower flush draw combinations. So our particular hand, for example, Queen 10-9-4, is just going to limp most of the good suits and then fold the very bad ones. Our combination with the Queen high suit, kind of just pure limp. So feeling a little bit better about including a limping range early on. We go 3-way and take a stab at the flop. I think this is reasonable. Firstly, Queen 10's just the best hand quite often and benefits from denying equity to 2 people with 8 cards that probably drawing relatively live against a weakish top pair. We can get some value from continues, 7-6-5 kind of thing. The hand plays okay if called because we can barrel some turns, we can turn some straight draws, we can turn some flush draws. With the exception of the 4, our 2 pair outs are pretty clean, stuff like that. Wouldn't hate checking back, but when we have a 10 and a 4, we don't get check raised all that often. The 4 is pretty important because it's kind of the hinge card around which all the straight draws form. So we're going to get check raised by wraps a little bit less often. We're going to get check raised by strong made hands a little bit less often. And so the upside of betting increases than if we had a slightly different looking combination, like, for example, a 7-6-5, which we could certainly also bet, but which would get check raised at a higher frequency. In an event, we just win the pot then and there. Flattered by Yabembas MP versus Under the Gun. And we go with C-bet here. I don't think our range is doing a great deal of betting on this texture because it's so dynamic and equities run pretty close. So IP just gets to over-realize their equity based on being able to, or based on the informational advantage of us having to react to a bunch of turn and river texture shifts. So we're typically going to want to check raise quite often, or check a lot and then check raise quite often to make it at most a 2-street betting game and to frequently end the pot then and there. If we do have some C-bets, and I think we can afford to have like a non-zero c-bet frequency here. I think hands like this, so a nut flush draw with pretty much no added equity, makes a reasonable candidate, because the nut flush draw is going to retain equity against anything he continues against. We have some barrel outs. We can turn like the 3 of clubs in an extreme example. And if we check and you bet, then your Benvas is kind of erratic enough that he's just capable of bombing it, and he bets full pot, and suddenly we're kind of already in a little bit of a tricky situation. I mean, I'd have to continue with the backdoor equity and the nut flush draw, but it would decrease the equity of my hand. And if I think he's going to put in a little bit more money than I'd like versus check, then the EV of betting with a hand like this increases by comparison. So yeah, I think betting is like defensible. I also certainly wouldn't have faulted the alternative. Turn, I think, is a super clear check. He just has too much good stuff, none of which I block, none of which he's folding. And I have the wrong kind of hand to waste as a bet fold. Maybe I wouldn't have to bet fold it, but I don't really care to find out what I'd have to do if I bet and get piled on. I'd rather just avoid that situation. If I had a hand like ace 10, 6, 5 with a double flush draw, I could see betting to pressurize, a lot of his like queen jack and queen 9 and stuff. But this kind of hand is just, it has some nut equity. It has kind of polarized equity on rivers, actually. But just no blockers to his continues. And so I think using it as a check call is pretty reasonable. The disadvantage is, I guess I do have to play rivers pretty honestly, but I don't see a way around that. It's just so bad that there are a lot of high equity hands, and those are super well represented in his range. And my particular combination just gives him even more of, or an even greater density of those combinations. So check, and it happens to check through, which is also kind of nice. I mean, that is one thing. Like it's the kind of thing that can easily be overlooked. But like, if I bet, then I'm guaranteeing money goes in on that street in a situation where I don't really want it to. Whereas if I check, like, yes, he's going to attack that check at a reasonable frequency, but sometimes I just get to see a free river, which is pretty nice. Having got the river in this way, like, the cards in my hand and the action to this point just mean that he has 2 pair, a whole bunch. I don't think he has many sets, because I think a lot of combinations of flop sets raise flop. He can have some hands like Queen, Queen 8, or, Queens with spades and stuff like that, but I would imagine those have a pretty high bet frequency on turn, although I can see mixing in some checks. So, yeah, I think he has a heavily diluted, and I beat a set of 4, so it's kind of irrelevant if he has those or not. Yeah, I think he has a heavily diluted set region, and then just an absolute ton of 2 pair. I think he turns a lot of hands that aren't 2 pair on turn into turn bluffs. So I think definitely get to value bet here, and we can go larger than I'd instinctively feel with like a board with multiple straights and multiple Broadway cards and stuff like that. I think even if technically we might not get to go that big, I think we can go large as an exploit against this particular opponent. We went with block, which I don't really like. Our hand is just worth more, and we get paid a lot, because if nothing else, we have all the flush draws blocked. So it's super easy for him to have like 1 spade and no clubs in his hand, and just suddenly in his mind, I have 50 million combinations of potential bluffs. He looks us up with 3 pair, which is a hand that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I feel like we missed a little bit of value here. I think this is actually an example of the type of hand that very good players will get more money out of. Like, that was kind of a pretty bad bet sizing mistake. And, I won the pod, and I got paid what I got paid. And it's kind of easy to just skip through. Okay, let's go on to the next hand. And selfishly, I suppose, to be honest, I kind of like to. But this is a situation where I could easily have just got paid. And what did I end up? So I could have just got paid like 3 or 4 big blinds more. And I think I get paid. I think he's pretty inelastic between like third and 2/3 pot. So yeah, I think this is pretty poor from me. The only thing I'd say in my defense is maybe I was trying to play like this sizing is only correct if I decide that I think I have to be completely balanced and I decide that I want to bet a ton of thin 2-pair for value, like Queen 4, maybe even stuff like Jack 10 9. Which I'm not convinced I would. And even if I do, then I can have 2 bet sizes. So yeah. Castigated myself enough for that, but it is important. Like, it would be the kind of thing that, were Phil doing a review, it would be kind of the leaks hiding in plain sight idea. I think that's a reasonable example of that. Standard call. We do a reasonable amount of 3-betting with double-suited Broadway pairs, but disconnected Jack 5 combination and 2 wheel cards. I think call is pretty reasonable. No particular reason to bet flop. We can get paid by some stuff and deny equity to some stuff, but it's nice to check back some hands that can continue on basically every card in the deck. And our hand also has kind of a non-nutted future equity distribution. You know, it has a little bit of current showdown value and a non-nut draw. So I think I do fine just checking this back. Turn, same kind of thing. Like, I have a little bit more polarity to my future equity distribution, but I still don't really gain anything clear by betting. And ranges are wide. Like, my range, I have to be conscious there that my range is very wide. So I don't get to just start finding the semi-careless bluffs, because, you know, my range will support it or whatever argument you can come up with. Like, this is the antithesis of that situation. My range definitely won't support me getting out of line. And so we end up checking down. And yeah, like one of the few hands that I could have got money good against, but I still don't hate checking kind of range versus range. Pretty clear just call here. It gets close, especially given that Ravenswood has like 30. Ravenswood with 30 big blinds, I probably am meant to 3-bet. If Linus and Ravenswood just switched seats, I think I still probably have to 3-bet, but it's not a great candidate. And yeah, it's nice to have like a strong Broadway combination in my big blind defense range, because something tells me Linus isn't going to be the type to shy away from applying pressure as the imposition player on boards that are favorable to the imposition player's range. Checks through, no interest in betting turn. Checks through, no interest in betting river. So this is tricky, I think. I think this is the kind of situation where you can easily end up overfolding if you aren't very conscious of the necessity to defend at a reasonably high frequency. Like, if I just think to myself, okay, well, I don't have an ace or better, so I'll fold, that's going to probably lead to me folding, at a guess, somewhere around half my range. I'm folding half my range against a half-pot bet on the river from a guy who checked back twice in position and doesn't have a bunch of, you know, ace-6, ace-7. I block him having ace-jack, like that kind of stuff. Suddenly it starts to seem like I'm letting him get away with highway robbery quite often. There is a thing, like, I don't think having so many Broadway cards is great for me here. Because from cutoff, he's going to have a narrower region or a narrower distribution of unpaired cards. Like, Button can have just more stuff that's all over the place. But when Linus is unpaired, he's usually unpaired with other Broadway stuff, because the other option is he has something like 10-9-8, which bets turn quite often. So I do block some of his potential river bluffs, but I'm also quite high in my range. And I also have reasonable removal. Because, I mean, you can go as deep as, like, I have no clubs in my hand, so it's more likely he just didn't flop a flush draw, didn't flop a pair, and gave up a no-hoper and is now just trying to take a shot at it. Depending on my exact river strategy, I could be relatively high in my range once we trim, you know, the zero showdown value folds, and that's kind of what's concerning me about the idea of folding. And blocking specifically the rivered pair is usually pretty good, because it makes it more likely that if IP were unpaired on turn or had something like 3x that he checked back for whatever reason on turn, he didn't improve on river. And therefore, again, just widens his potential bluffing region. If I'm sometimes checking stuff like ace-jack to check raise, which I definitely am, or definitely should be, and would think that I am, checking some stuff like jack-9, ace-3 to induce, I could check, for example, a combination like ace-6-3. It's a better hand, obviously, but I get paid less when I have 3-pair. Then folding is just about okay, I think. If I'm always betting those hands, then I'm likely or even just frequently betting those hands, then I'm likely overfolding if I end up folding this hand. And it doesn't seem like the ideal kind of guy to start overfolding against. Same opponent, different positions. C-bet flop seems decent with the ace of diamonds and a queen. Just again, same logic as earlier in a slightly different context. I get check raised a lot less often when I have the ace of diamonds queen, and I can fold out some stuff with pretty decent equity. I make him fold 10-9, 8-7, no backdoor flush draw. That's kind of nice. Could have gone slightly larger. No big deal, I guess. There's kind of just taking it back, there's kind of two ways of thinking about c-bet sizing as the imposition player on dynamic boards. One is that you want to size up because you deny equity to more viable continues out of position has against smaller bet sizes. The other is that you gain more by betting small because then you make it more likely that the action will extend across a higher number of streets. And therefore you get to utilize positional advantage on what is a dynamic texture over a greater number of streets, a greater number of betting rounds, which will work to your advantage. I've seen solvers go both ways. Generally speaking, if the SPR is low enough that you can use the small sizing and still be able to get all in by the river, then it's often favored the smaller bet size. And certainly in like 3-bet pot situations, like let's say versus as the potential IP stabber on a dynamic texture, it's always going to pick the smaller sizing. And I think that reason is part of it, or there are definitely other considerations, as there always are. But this is the sizing we go with. And actually, I'm just realizing now that for some reason I had it in my head that pot was 30k and I bet half pot. So yeah, this is a fine and kind of normal sizing to use. I'll leave the previous discussion in there because I think it developed into something that accidentally made a worthwhile point. Linus defends, and on this turn we go with big bet, which I think is a relatively significant error. I'm not entirely sure what I was thinking. I assumed that I was using the ace of diamonds, but I'm obviously using the ace of diamonds to attempt to generate more folds and deny equity to stuff. But this is just not a very commonly used bet size in this situation. You typically see, as I said in other content, and I'm going to briefly demo it now. On boards such as this, so it's like this is changed up a little bit because this was a sim I had in my collection, but we have like a 2 Broadway and then a wheel card and then another wheel card coming on turn that completes a flush. So I think pretty similar. And what we see is the outline of a 2-bet size strategy where there are some hands going small, there are a lot of hands going large, and then not very many hands in the middle. And that's because the objective of using the small sizing is to deny equity to straight draws. And straight draws are already going to start folding around, like if we say, okay, so we bet this sizing and he has, Jack 10-9. Well, that's already folding a lot of the time against this sizing. There's no need to bet anymore. And therefore, given that third pot is kind of the inflection point for straight draws, or maybe even slightly smaller, that's the bet sizing we go with. Because otherwise, it's just like, put very simply, we're risking more than we need to. If the objective of the small sizing is to make a certain hand class fold, and that certain hand class starts to fold around the third pot range, then why would we want to bet half or 2/3 or 34% pot? It's kind of like a negative free roll. And in general terms, that's why you typically bet pretty small when the primary purpose of your bet is to deny equity rather than to generate value, because otherwise you're just paying too steep a price for achieving the objective you're going for. So if we just create a hand class here of hands that are likely to bet for equity denial, so let's do better than Queen Deuce, not better than a flush. And then let's say, okay, so we have the Ace of Hearts, the King of Hearts, Ten of Hearts, these kinds of hands. There's a strong preference to put these hands in the small bet size. There are a couple of reasons for this. The first one is the one that I gave. The second is that a lot of these hands might be planning to turn themselves into bluffs on certain rivers. And the bigger we go on turn, the lower EV that river bluff has, because the stronger a range will now be bluffing into. And so a combination like something with the Ace of Hearts is most likely going to bluff at a very high frequency. Actually, Ace of Hearts with 2-pair probably isn't going to do very much bluffing. But some combination that does end up bluffing is going to benefit from bluffing into a wider range that has more stuff like maybe slightly stronger versions like Queen 10-9 with the 10 of Hearts, or Queen Deuce Queen 5 as we do. It would benefit from facing off against a range denser in those combinations and less dense in combinations of flushes that make superior bluff catchers because they block 2 hearts rather than 1. This is in contrast to, or rather the influence that straight draws have on our bet sizing choice can be pretty clearly demonstrated if we look at an alternative turn that completes multiple straights. And now we have none of these bets, none of these equity denial bets, only full pot size bets. And there are 2 reasons for this. The first is that the downside of betting for equity denial is increased when there are more hands that your hand loses to. Part of the nice thing about betting Queen Deuce is that your hand just naturally beats a lot of their range. Like if we bet third pot and we say, okay, how often does out of position have better than Queen 5? It's like half the time. How often does out of position have better than Queen 5 now? Nearly all the time. So the difference is pretty clear. Like you're betting a combination that just beats half of the other guy's range in the first example. Over here, that's not the case, and therefore you stop betting those hands. Because you stop betting those hands, obviously your range becomes a lot more polar, and therefore you pick the larger bet size. But the other piece of the puzzle is that part of the reason we were choosing this sizing specifically over on the left is that it was the sizing at which straight draws started to fold, that straight draws started to become 0 EV. Okay, so a straight draw becomes 0 EV around third pot on this turn, but a straight isn't going to become 0 EV versus this sizing on this turn. If we bet this sizing better than 9-8, not better than a flush, these combinations, which like 20% of the out of position player's range, are just always calling. Obviously, we don't need to keep betting small. We can follow it up on the river, but we won't always follow it up on the river, and out of position can sometimes cool down and whatever else. But given that the dominating factor, or rather what we're making use of here as the in-position player, is a characteristic that straights and straight draws both have, which is that they're dead to value bets. And so we need to pick a sizing. If a lot of the time we're trying to pressurize those hands, we need to pick a sizing that accomplishes that most effectively. Because a lot of straights are going to fold versus full pot. Better than 9-8, not better than a flush. Versus the big sizing. And now they're folding half of them. Because who really wants to, it's not fun to call a hand that's dead to your opponent's value region with a card to come. Out of position would way rather call a combination with lower showdown value, like, a set. Because the nice thing about having a set here is that if your opponent's value betting, you're still not dead. So better than deuces, not better than 9-8. We're mostly, we're calling a lot more sets than we are straights, basically. And so the in-position bet sizing on a board that creates multiple straights, which therefore out of position is going to have a straight quite often, in-position's bet sizing strategy is going to be focused around decreasing the EV of that region. Back to the hand, and I'm really not sure what this bet's trying to accomplish. The SPR's set up to be around 4, so if anything, by betting full pot on turn, I can shove river and some of my range is obviously going to want to do that. So this seems not so good. But we get bailed out. Like, we very, very frequently have the best hand here. Linus is check raising a ton of sets on flop, I would think. Certainly enough that every full house with SPR1 versus check is going to be a slam dunk value bet. It's not fantastic to block the ace of diamonds, but it's not like super tragic either. And at this point, yeah, we just have full pot. Our value region here is going to be like ace, the nut flush with a queen, I would think. Maybe the nut flush with a 10 sometimes. And then every full house. And that's, I guess, part of the reason why, you go small on turn is that so when you bomb river, now you can actually have full houses. Or equally, like you can bet turn and the board pairs on the river and out of position doesn't have this massive polarity advantage because you never have a full house because you've constructed a strategy that ensures that you do. In any event, Linus folds river. Pretty standard open. Checked here, and I'm not totally sure why. Given the cards in my hand, I think it checks around a bunch. Linus doesn't have a ton of stabs when I block a queen, 2 tens, a jack, and 2 diamonds. Equally, my hand isn't the type that particularly gains from letting people see free cards. There's also a multi-way thing that goes on that I think is semi-relevant here, although it typically occurs with slightly different hands, where people bet hands that seem to be kind of natural checks. Now, my hand definitely isn't a natural check, but the objective of this bet, when you make it with those type of hands, the normal example is you bet a lot of combinations of king-king that don't seem to gain very much, because it turns out the goal is to fold one guy off a slightly better hand that he has a whole bunch of. So in that case, it will be like betting a load of king-king to fold someone who opened from early position off aces, which in a 3-way pot they'll do reasonably often. So to make the example clearer, potentially, if it checks to Linus here, at equilibrium, you'll see a higher bet frequency with king-king than you might think, including some combinations that don't make a ton of sense, or don't seem to make a ton of sense, like king-king 7-5 with clubs. I haven't simmed that or anything, but that's just like a representative example of the sims that I've looked at in other contexts. And then the objective is to make Cleaner sometimes call with worse, and me to sometimes fold aces, some combination of aces. And that kind of applies here in that I can bet Queen X, and one of the nice things that can happen is that Linus can fold pocket kings, which is not a fantastic hand for me to end up in a heads up pot against because blocks my outs and currently beats me and whatever else. So, yeah, given that I can get him to fold a lot of combinations of slightly better hands, given that I shouldn't expect him to stab super often, given that my hand is worth a bet, I think check is kind of bad. It's not bad to the extent that check is going to lose a ton of EV, but yeah, there's just no particular reason to have a strategy involving checking this hand at a high frequency. I guess I could have been low frequency randomizing or whatever. Who knows? Having checked flop, turn kind of muddies the waters a little bit because now people can have aces up quite a lot. And my hand doesn't. The problem is that problem with betting turn is that my hand doesn't really make a good 2-street bluff, because once I bet and get called, and the river is, the 7 of hearts or some complete brick, then I'm blocking the hands that I need my opponent to have to auto-fold. So I don't really like betting my hand, and bet checking my hand seems like it doesn't accomplish a whole lot. I just get money in against, ace 3 quite often and stuff like that. So I don't hate small bet. I think big bet would probably be bad. And I think I probably want big bets in general because I have quite a big polarity advantage. So I guess checking turn becomes reasonable. I guess now, again, it nicely protects my checking range as well. And the river check seems standard, and that's why you don't give free cards, I guess. Yeah, it seems generally unsatisfying, but likely not exactly terrible. Yeah, call seems good here against 2.6 or whatever X. Don't think he's short enough to 3-bet. Don't think he's opening wide enough that I can 3-bet. My hand's clearly too strong to fold. Bong Bob's joined the table, who's just very much very much fits the profile of the several people described already, just like a long-time reg at mid and high stakes who puts you in tough spots pretty often. Ravenswood bombs this flop, and we go with fold, and I actually think this is fine. I don't really have a way of continuing that makes me a bunch of money, because if I call, I have pretty bad visibility and playability on turns, and if I shove, then I'm getting in like SPR4 with a hand that he can have crushed super easily. Like he can just have kings with spades, and I have like 20% equity or something. If you bet smaller, then the EV of calling increases because I'm risking less to get the chance to, turn a queen or a 10 and get some money in good. But against full pot, I think folding is best. Standard open, get it through. Standard open, get it through again. Very easy to defend. And we go with lead here. I think IP checks back decently often as under the gun RFI on a texture like this. He just has a bunch of aces without diamonds, kings without diamonds, that kind of thing. And the board's coordinated enough that he probably doesn't get to bet just everything in his range, especially if I'm defending. I'll be defending a little bit tight against 3x from under the gun, so it's not a scenario where he's like min-raised button and I just have every hand in my range. Like I probably have about 60, maybe a shade over 60%, so maybe not even actually. Yeah, versus 3x, even in rake free, I probably have more like 40, 45, so I do okay on. I'm competitive on this texture, so I think he checks back reasonably often. Quite a lot of one pair hands in his range that prefer to see a turn because that turn will more clearly define their equity situation. My hand isn't a fantastic lead because there are a lot of hands that I'll be forced to check even at lowish SPR. A lot of turns I'll be forced to check at lowish SPR rather, but backdoor flush draw plus gutter seems a decent choice. I also get a bet in pretty good against high frequency IP checkbacks. I can make him call weaker Queen X. Just like King 5-4, that kind of thing. I also sometimes I make him fold at reasonable equity. He can have Ace King 10-5 double suited, and I make him fold. The fact that I have to play turns pretty honestly isn't amazing, but that is going to be less of a downside at lowish SPR where play is more straightforward anyway. Like, the fact that I mostly have to play face up on turns with a combination like this is a reason to not lead it at SPR 12. Not so much a reason not to lead it at SPR 3. So I think this is at least reasonable. I definitely think my range wants a lot of leads, or some reasonable amount of leads on this board. And this is kind of an awkward turn because a lot of stuff improved, but I've hit a card where I have enough equity to stack off. And so I think we just go with shove. Get the max from his, ace 10-9 whatever with nut diamonds, that kind of thing. We get it in, and he turned me, well, not dead, but pretty dead. But this is a hand that I get a bet in very good against on flop, and he can definitely check flop back with this hand. So not unhappy about how that played out. Obviously would have preferred a different outcome, but there you go. We go with full pot here. So there's absolutely nothing interesting about the play of this hand. We open and get an open through. I wanted to point out, though, a little pre-flop thing that occurs in tournaments, and I guess in cash games as well, although you'll just be up against like a 12 big blind stack in cash games at a lower frequency, which is that you're going to want to size up against shorter stack big blinds to decrease the EV to them of calling, and they're going to get to call wider when they're shorter. and so on and so forth. So by way of demonstration, on the left-hand side, we have everyone has like 10 big blinds effective. I guess this is slightly different because me and your Bembas are deeper, but just to make the general point, we can talk about asymmetric stack size distribution and the effect it has on strategies another time. So on the right, we're 50 deep. On the left, we're 10 deep. And if you notice on the left, we have a very simple strategy. We raise full pot or we fold. On the right, we have a lot more interest in playing kind of a multi-pronged strategy. Don't want to go into it in too much depth, but hitting the high points quickly. The main strategic benefit of the options that aren't raising full pot seems to be that you don't ever have to fold pre-flop. Like if we open full pot, get 3-bet by the small blind, we're folding that frequency nearly a third of the time. If we open for half pot and get 3-bet, we're never folding because we get to create a deeper post-flop SBR, basically, and it's more like if we'd opened full pot at 100 big blinds, where, again, we don't do very much folding. The limping strategy, same kind of thing. If we limp in position, as I've said possibly a few times, we're just pure calling versus one ISO, basically always. We never have a limp re-raise component. We never have a limp folding component unless action explodes behind us. In general terms, the distribution of hands between ranges from across these three perspectives seems to be like hands that go in full pot are either hands that don't care about folding versus 3-bet. So hands that are going for the straight steal. So for example, ace king without a suit is just going to basically fold or full pot because we don't want to see flops at a higher frequency because our hand plays kind of badly plays kind of badly in a post-flop scenario. We just want to use our high cards to generate as many folds as we can immediately. So those hands are going to go full pot. And then the other hands that seem to like to go in the full pot range are those that don't have to fold versus 3-bet, those that lose the least EV against 3-bet. And that's generally going to be the 4-bet candidates. So aces, for example, is mainly going to go in large, as is something like ace king. And then if we have something like a one-gapper that's single-suited, again, heavy preference there. We have a combination like Jack 10, 7, 6, which for some reason vanished. I guess it's not a one-gapper. Yeah, but these kind of hands go in large because they can sometimes 4-bet and that kind of thing. The other things worth pointing out is a balance or a way that the solver balances its ranges that you often see in multi-bet size pre-flop options where the very best hands are usually going in full pot quite often. So we did, the aces and the ace king just going large a whole bunch. So usually a lot of the next best are going to go in other ranges to give those ranges some kind of support. So by way of example, if we look at the top 5% of hands, there's like overwhelming preference for the large bet size, and then 5 to 10, a few more small sizings creep in. 10 to 15, now we're actually favoring the smaller sizing, and then 15 to 20, again, now we're working in more limps, but we're favoring the smaller sizing over the full pot sizing. So in general terms, like the very best hands go in large, and then a lot of the pretty good hands are going to go in the other options, but primarily in this instance, the kind of 2.2x or whatever. And having looked at the runtime, that actually seems like a pretty decent stopping point for part 4. Hopefully everyone's enjoying the series so far. Feel free to leave me any questions, comments, feedback, so on and so forth in the thread below, or reach out to me elsewhere. Until next time, it's been Richard Grieco for RunItOnce.com. Take care.